Hi, I'm Jeff Nyquist, and with me is Alex Benesch in Germany. I'm in the United States, and this is Friends and Enemies. Today we're going to talk about Michael Waller's book, Big Intel. We're going to talk about how the United States got infiltrated, how the FBI and CIA got compromised. One of the major mechanisms, which comes out of the Institute for Social Research and the Frankfurt School, which was and turns out an operation begun out of a meeting in the Kremlin in 1922. So I, one of the things I really want to talk about is the concept of how they organize these ideas and push them forward into education, because I had firsthand knowledge of this as a education, as getting my teaching credential 40 years ago. And the things I saw, the fact that the communists got interested in me, tried to recruit me, and so I could see who was what, and I could see where they were getting their concepts from, that they were connected to the Communist Party USA, which is a loyal to Moscow party. I mean, the Communist Party USA swore its allegiance to the Soviet Union, the motherland of socialism. And that was not that long ago. And those people have not gone away. And so, Alex, why don't you begin, giving me your impression of and telling the listeners of Waller's book?
Now, I grabbed the digital copy. I read the whole thing, and it basically the book is asking the question: what ultimately built the success of these communist operations? So, what's their secret sauce? How did they do it? And of course, he identifies really solid spycraft. I mean, he tells you how good they were at the spy game, and at the same time in the United States, intelligence was oftentimes improvised. You know, he talks about the OSS and how they recruited all kinds of people from universities, very different bright minds, but they were lacking sort of that core spycraft structure oftentimes, and it was just improvised overnight seemingly. So the OSS, he tells us, was in deep trouble from the very beginning. And he also, so this is the one thing he talks about, the really solid spycraft. Now, the other thing, the other big secret, I think, is, and this is all part of the book, the other secret is the communists very early on used groundbreaking psychology work. Now, this happened in Germany even in the 1850s. So this was half a century before Sigmund Freud and all these guys. This is when leading scientists were studying the human mind, and they were even getting into psychometrics, how people really functioned. And so at that point, scientists were working with people who were troubled, who had mental problems or had all kinds of problems. And so these scientists would work with these people, thereby figuring out the average household in Germany. So where the problems are, how it all worked, what the dynamic was. And by gaining access to all this knowledge, the communists had sort of a head start, because they used this method, which they learned from Germany, and then they transferred that method to the United States. So they also worked with patients, people, gay people. There was a lot of sexual research done in Germany early on. So they knew how many people were gay on average and how this worked in a family context, and then what the father in the family was like on average, and how he would treat his wife and his kids, and how they would keep certain secrets and all that stuff. So that was a scientific base added to these already solid tradecraft by communists. And I think there's a third factor in this, and this is not explicit in J. Michael Waller's book, because you can never find this anywhere really. You have to piece it together yourself. And I think the third factor, besides spycraft and science, the third factor is the communists used Britain as a side door into America. Because if you're already inside Britain, you can then possibly gain access to old British intelligence networks in the United States. Now, Waller talks about how the OSS was built, the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, built with British help. And that brought problems right into the OSS. And this was not just, compromised MI6 people that, messed up the OSS, but you also have sort of these networks such as Skull and Bones, which sort of originated with Britain. And so there's multiple angles where communists may get access or may have gotten access to an old British network inside the United States. And I think this is one of the angles that is often overlooked because you're so busy talking to people about even the basic spycraft, the elements of spycraft. You have to communicate that. And then getting into all this science.
Let's talk about the elements of spycraft for a minute, because it is, one of my readers even noticed this. In Chapter 9, Waller has a subsection called "We Will Take Over the Intellectuals," and that's where he quotes Billy Munzenberg as saying, "We will take over the intellectuals and we'll make them stink," right? Which we can see they have made them pretty stinky now. It's pretty much true. But here we read about how the Institute for Social Research, which was the project to make the intellectuals stink in Germany, set up in Frankfurt in 1923 with money from a communist shill, basically a businessman who put it out there for them. And we can see how all of these Marxists, some of them members of the Communist Party, others fellow travelers, gravitated towards this Frankfurt school. And they did indeed. They used psychology. They used all these methods, but they ended up getting this to New York because they had John Dewey, the icon of the head of the National Teachers Association, which we should talk about as one of these satellite communist organizations, because the teacher who tried to recruit me as a communist was a leader in the National Education Association back in the 1980s, and a Communist Party, obviously involved with the Communist Party because she got me to go to a Communist Party USA meeting. And the Communist Party USA, for those that don't know it, was taking orders from Moscow. They had a sworn allegiance in 1919 to Moscow, to the Soviet Union, to the Russian socialists. And so this is a very important, this is what Waller describes under front organizations as the vertical. It comes from Moscow Center, it goes down, and it goes to all the places in the world where the agents are. And the agents are instructed to then horizontally move into organizations that are not communist, like teachers unions, like labor unions, like the arts, trade, business, religious groups, to go into all these groups and to try to get influence, try to take them over and infiltrate them, try to promote other communist cadres into the groups. And, it's everything from being able to influence people in those groups to being able to outright take over the groups.
Yeah.
And if their group is taken over, it becomes a communist front organization. It effectively just molds everything it does to what the communists want people to think.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's interesting in the book by Waller, how he explains that even a relatively small number of assets can have a giant influence over an organization. And people have to remember, if you think of any kind of organization, a lot of these members are kind of lazy and they're laid back and stuff like that. But these communist assets, they have resources, they have training, they know exactly what they're doing. So just by being so active and fanatic and professional, they can gain influence over an organization. And by, with the statement from Willy Münzenberg when he said, "We're going to make everything stink, we're going to just infect everything." Imagine how few people it takes to ruin an organization. Some people, they have had this experience in a workplace. They work at a company. Everything's going great. Everybody likes everybody. Everybody gets along. It's not a hassle to go to work. You actually enjoy going to work, get things done. But then there's like this one new guy, or maybe 3-5 new guys, and they can ruin everything. They can just completely poison the way this company, this organization feels. So they can cause so much trouble, and they can realize where possible tensions are or how you can create tension. So a small group of professionals, they can be really, really, really effective, especially when they get these resources. And of course, to
Yeah,
be able,
and they also they're more active, they're more dedicated, and they'll be more verbal.
yeah.
So a lot of people in an organization, they kind of listen and they maybe make a comment here and there, but they don't have an agenda. So they're not really trying to shape other people's opinions or guide the group in a different area. And I've been in groups where I've seen things being introduced, and I'm thinking, why is this getting front and center? Why is this being
Mm,
introduced? And I'll give you an example. When I was in getting my teaching credential, okay, so I'm in the class with my master teacher, and she's the one that tried to recruit me as a communist. And we it's a nice sunny day, so we go out to the picnic tables, and this lady comes, who's another person from the National Education Association, and she's got the new program that they're going to be introducing in the schools in California, and it's called multicultural history curriculum, right? Everything's going to go to multiculturalism. This is the wave of the future. She's describing it. And of course, I have been to the communist meeting, and I've heard the Marxist Leninists say we're going to take over the Democratic Party through its left wing, and we're going to change everything. And I'm putting this together in my mind in real time as I'm listening to this multicultural Well, by coincidence, when I was a junior in high school in California, they have the juniors in high school have a year of American history. And I had Harriet Kellerman from New York. She was my history teacher. And she had volunteered her classes to be the pilot for multicultural history. So we had a different history book than all the other classes in our school. It was the multicultural, it was the first one. And I remember my first homework assignment to read the first 2 or 3 chapters of this book, and I was dumbfounded. It was how evil the Columbus was, how horrible the founding fathers were, how America was about racism, and it was about killing Indians, and it was just this very dark picture of America as this horrible place. And I remember we were supposed to write a little paper showing that we'd read the chapters, and I remember I wrote a pretty angry paper about it, because this is anti-patriotism, right? They're teaching you to hate your country. It was very clear from the book. So here I know exactly what this multiculturalism is. I was in one of the pilot program classes 10 years earlier, when I was a well 9 years 8 9 years earlier, when I was a junior in high school. So I knew that this was, I realized, ding, 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 this is coming from communism. She's in the Communist Party, the USA. She's trying to recruit for them. There's the vertical. It's coming
yeah.
down from Moscow saying, so see, this isn't, for those who want to say, oh, the School for Social Research, it has no connection with Moscow, it has no connection with communist subversion. I was there.
Yeah.
I
And it's
knew the
also,
people that were organizing it.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's also the very same thing that was completely illegal in the Soviet Union. Almost any form of activism was completely forbidden. So if you did even a fraction of the same thing in the Soviet sphere, you were hunted and tried like a criminal. So if you just pick one cause, environmental causes, women's rights, because women's rights were terrible in the Soviet Union. If some party member, was, got some ideas about a young woman, the party member got his way, and there was no way of rectifying the situation or improving the situation overall, because activism was illegal. So they know exactly how powerful activism can be, especially, bad activism or misguided activism. And people have to realize it's a strategy that not just targets people that are a minority, right? So you, of course, you can make minorities angry, black people, Latinos, gays, whatever. But for every one of these minority people you can activate and use, there are several more people that will latch onto the cause because they want to be nice, or they just don't understand the bigger game, and it's just, so you're not just getting this one person from the minority, you're getting like 10 more people from the general population, because the communists, because they have all the science, they know how the average person in America, what this person is like. So the average person was never really in contact with, let's say, powerful structures. They've never had to put themselves mentally in a position of, how do we run a country? How do we make everything safe? How do we make tough decisions? But they just live their normal lives, and then they attach themselves to a cause, even though they're themselves are not part of that minority. So this is where you get all these white kids latching on to Black Lives Matter, support Black Lives Matter, or they support
Sure.
some other cause and some other cause, some other cause. Even Professor Carroll Quigley wrote about this in his thick book Tragedy and Hope. At about page 800 to 900, he starts talking about all these other things. And he makes this distinction. He says that these aristocratic families that he was familiar with, they have a completely different mindset. So they have this understanding of, how the world works. But he says the average person is just, can be easily drawn into something. So out of the wish to help people. So instead of fixing things and really, becoming powerful yourself, you just latch onto somebody else's cause, and of course over time, more people, especially people who didn't have a lot of money, they also became the direct target, because now this is also a weak group, and you have to agitate against the dominant group, and almost all of these texts from the Frankfurt School. All these texts by all these famous authors, all these texts, this is just the obfuscation layer, because it's gibberish, and it's people notice this over time, that this is super crazy gibberish, and especially in the German original language, because the German language, you can use all kinds of words with triple meanings, and you can create these weird sentences that make no sense at all. And so this is what they used, but underneath was cold hard science and spycraft. So you're designing a subversion strategy, and you're using science, especially psychology, to do it. So, for example, here's
And
one thing.
there's a conscious use of cognitive dissonance. And I remember this master teacher of mine, she lectured on cognitive dissonance, and I thought, why is she lecturing on this? Wow, what is the connection? How is cognitive dissonance relevant to multicultural history and all the rest of it? And what's really interesting is what you just said about, how you can get white people to join the communist groups, even when you're mainly appealing to minorities. So like in multicultural history, they're really trying to recruit Indian Americans, Black Americans, women, Mexican Americans, which at that time when I was a kid, they were maybe, I don't know, 15% of the population. Well, with women, it's more than half, right? So if you can actually get all women, and then if you can get a certain percentage of white people, you got a majority of those people. And it's very interesting if you look at the Road to Socialism, which anybody can go online. It's the Communist Party USA's program, and it's been their program for about 15, 16 years, the Road to Socialism. And it actually explains how it works, that they're trying to form a majority from women and minorities that then will be able to push past the U.S. Constitution, get rid of it, and have a true economic democracy, because the U.S. Constitution prevents economic democracy, which is the real socialism, right? So they're talking about overthrowing the Constitution right there.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting. So what is this? Is cognitive dissonance not a part of this, where you can you can actually accept going against yourself, your own interest?
Well, it's it's about activating those emotions, and it's about activating something like empathy, for example. So let's say let's say you have a traditional father, right? So the father is in his 40s, let's say, okay? And so the father has spent a considerable amount of time building a family and building a career, and he's done military service, so he's experienced things, and he knows how tough it is to create something and how difficult other people can be and what really works and what doesn't. So this experience, this outlook, this more realistic outlook on the world that you have in a man that's like 40 years old or 45 years old, this perception of reality differs greatly from that man's children when they grow up in a leftist school system, in this sort of sheltered environment. So
Right.
this
In
is
fact, that's
complete.
what that was
Yeah,
one of Dewey's things. He believed that teaching children to become individual achievers was a communist plot.
exactly.
So his methods would detach the children
Yeah.
from their parents.
So you
Yeah.
have this disconnect, and of course, if you have psychologists in Germany or other places, psychologists that worked with people, you get a view inside of a traditional family, and so these young kids, they are not as in tune with reality yet. So it's easier for them to feel empathy with a minority group or something, and then just engage in activism, because activism is mostly just talk. It's very primitive. It's very simple, and they think that by doing these simple tasks, they can actually cause positive change. And so this is where the disconnect happens between these parents and the kids, because the parents, they know it's not as simple to have change, and you have to have security, and you have to have these achievements, and you have to become somebody in this world, and you have to look at your own money, you have to look at your own career, and you should marry somebody who is sharp, marry somebody who knows these things. And so there's something which the Frankfurt School has come up with, and it's a concept. They call it the authoritarian personality. So this is kind of the people that they target. And so they talked about the authoritarian personality, and they already were using psychometrics to figure out who was an authoritarian personality to them. So they were measuring in scales. They actually had these scales like we would use today with all the digital wizardry. They were measuring the degree of conventionalism in a person. So how much this person likes, traditional things. They were measuring authoritarian submission, which means how much somebody is integrating himself into a hierarchy. This does not have to be a bad thing, but of course the communists paint it as bad. It can be really good and important. They measure authoritarian aggression. That means the tendency to punish aggressions against traditional values. And they measure a couple other things. Superstition and stereotype, that's what they call it. They measure power and toughness, identification with rulers, destructiveness and cynicism, projectivity. And that means if somebody really believes in the existence of evil, right? And some other things. So this is what they were working on.
Projectivity, that's interesting. Whether they believe in the existence of evil. So they're, what is that? Where does that word come from? Is that from projection, from psychological projection?
I don't know where they get these names from, but this is the definition according to them. So they want to know if somebody believes in real, true evil, or if somebody doesn't have a real concept of evil and it's just up in the air and you can manipulate them. So they will measure different people, let's say in the United States, and they figure out, okay, this person scores really high on the authoritarian scale. And then if they have information on the kids, they may see a disconnect. So father is authoritarian according to communism, but the kids are different because they're just developing and they don't know anything. And so this is how they designed the program, because at its core, critical theory is the simplest thing ever. It's just subversion. But by using science or psychometrics in this case, they can really make this stuff work. And so these scientists, they worked in Germany, then they fled the Nazis, went to the United States. Some of them came back and did some more research. So you had the Frankfurt Institute of Social Research, financed by Felix Weil. So he was kind of German, Argentinian, had a Jewish background. And in 1923, Mr. Weil was financing a regular conference, so where they were bringing all these people together. And one of the persons involved in setting up these conferences, one of these persons was Richard Sorge, who was a star spy for the Soviet communist GRU. Eventually, the Japanese caught him and executed him because the Soviets said, no, he's not one of us. We don't admit anything. So that was the end of him. And
Yeah, he was very famous, by the way. He was the spy that within Japan
yeah,
got the information to Stalin that Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor.
exactly. And
So
so
Stalin had when the German armies had started the Moscow campaign, Stalin had the freedom then to send his Far Eastern armies that were watching his front with Japan, because Japan was
yeah.
had armies in Manchuria, to send them back to Moscow to save the day in the autumn of 1941.
Yeah. And so in 1930, Max Horkheimer took over the institute, and he published what he called a fundamental critique of the average society. This was kind of the result of all this analysis that had been done. So, for example, if you have a German family, and let's say the daughter in the family has severe mental problems. So this daughter would see one of these psychiatrists, these early psychiatrists, and then she would tell this guy things, what was going on at home, and she would talk about some of these contradictions maybe that the father was exhibiting, or some of the compromises he had to do in life. This is something that young people don't understand yet. But all this data was fed to these shrinks, and all this stuff was then ending up in Mr. Horkheimer's analysis. So they knew exactly where the weak points in society were. And so by amplifying all these problems, they could gain access to more people who were dissatisfied but didn't really understand all these issues. Because of course Germany was a difficult society, and people had to do all these, they had to make all these compromises in life. That was just what it was. But instead of presenting a broad, fair analysis and suggesting ways to improve society, they were just looking for the bad stuff. They was looking for the dirty secrets, and that's how they understood society, probably better than society understood itself. So you have these average German guys, and you had these average American people, no idea about psychology, and then you had these communist shrinks who were experts, really, and they knew all the secrets. They knew how all this stuff worked. And so, for example, let's say World War I happened. So you had all these German men going to war, returning from war, and that caused a lot of problems. The alcoholism and just aggression and all that type of stuff. And so
PTSD.
Yeah, the PTSD, but all that was just painted as, well, these are just authoritarian people, and everything they say is bad, because if they teach you to be a certain way and be successful and marry into somebody who is successful and climbing the ladder, everything they say is bad. This was practically what they were doing with this institute. And so then they published, Mr. Horkheimer and Mr. Adorno, they published the Dialectic of Enlightenment. And this is basically them trashing Enlightenment because it just didn't overnight magically solved all the problems. So they were trashing the Enlightenment as a stupid cult, while at the same time these people were praising socialism, even though socialism itself had all the markings of a cult. Everything became mythology. So they're critiquing, Enlightenment and say, well, they just turned this all into a great legend and myth and stuff. But what did the leftists do? Karl Marx, this idiot who couldn't deal with people and couldn't deal with money, Karl Marx was turned into the prophet. Not the Messiah yet, but that became Lenin. But Marx was the prophet, and Lenin was sort of the Messiah. Complete cult mentality. And so this is also the text which shaped German thinking for multiple generations. So you can still see that on television shows and everything. It's this idea that you cannot leave people, especially men, you cannot leave them and just let them live their lives. They have to be put into a socialist system. Otherwise, they turn into these authoritarian types and then fascists and imperialists and basically demons. So it's an exorcism, right? It's sort of like, these people have to be domesticized because letting them just be, then the monster comes out. They turn into these complete monsters.
Testosterone poisoning.
Yeah, toxic masculinity. I recently tried to watch the new Napoleon movie, by the way, which is another example of this. The new Napoleon movie by Sir Ridley Scott. So an aristocratic Brit makes a movie about the French emperor, and that's not really the only problem here. But the problem of the movie is that it's pure Frankfurt School critical theory. Now, Napoleon was just a workhorse. He was really good at scoping the battlefield and, learning about the previous battles on that territory, and he was really hands-on, and he was successful in the military sense. And he just, did this step by step, defend France, do this, do that. So nothing really too out of the ordinary. But in the movie, Napoleon is this cliche weirdo psychopath who has a mommy complex and wants to be a toddler. So he forces Josephine, his actually meaningless wife, he just forces her to adore him, and she must say, you are the most important thing in the world. So this is like what a toddler or a baby, thinks. He wants to be the center of everything. And so the whole movie is just a display of this is toxic masculinity. So forget about defending a country and just trying to establish security and, making all these compromises and just hoping for the best, which is really tough to do. No, it was just toxic masculinity. He had a mommy complex, and he was just like Hitler, and it was all just insane. And this is why he did this. That's the movie.
In the movie, it's sort of like the woman character Josephine, and of course the women character, his new wife, his Austrian wife. They just sort of want him to calm down, and of course Josephine just wanted him to stick with her. He was his true love. So why did he want to have all these ambitions, have a son, which she couldn't give him? And so he just should have stuck with her and been a peaceable guy. This kind of orientation, so that it was the masculine drive for power and prestige and to defend France and to expand his dynasty that basically was everything that was wrong with him, which is what made him kill so many people. There's no real historical nuance in this, but yeah, it has a smattering of the feminine is right, the masculine is wrong, just do what the women want, kind of
And you
thing.
cannot
And
let
of course,
men be
yeah,
men. They have to be domesticized. They have to be brought under control. And just if you feminize everything, then you will eliminate evil. Now, this is of
you'll
course,
eliminate war and
yeah,
killing. Yeah. Mm.
and this is key to every single cult that ever existed, because the cult will tell you they have understood evil like nobody else, and they have the tools and the methods and the handbook to defeat evil. Now, of course, socialism was as primitive as it gets. They did not have a scientific modern idea about evil, and they had no real way of defeating evil. And so these guys like Horkheimer and Adorno, they always presented themselves as scientists. They wanted to be known as scientists. But what does a scientist do? Experimentation and learning from experiment. Now, over there in the Soviet Union, there was a really large-scale, real-life experiment going on, and it was a failure. Right? Everything failed in the Soviet Union that was supposed to work, especially morality and fixing exploitations and all that. So
But we
here,
can shoot you. We can shoot you and put you in the gulag and say it works. So nobody
yeah.
dares say it doesn't
So
work.
yeah, so it's like me saying I built a space rocket in my backyard, and if you say, well, if you demand proof or you doubt me, I just kill you. And that's the way I can present myself as a scientist who built a space rocket in his backyard. So if you want to be a scientist, you cannot just analyze what's bad in the West and then use it for destruction of the West. I mean, if you want to be a scientist, you have to look at the East and see what goes wrong, what went wrong, and why it went wrong. But this is, of course, not what these scientists did. Now, some of these Frankfurt guys, they became a bit critical of the Soviet Union, but they were brought back in line because otherwise they would have been killed. As you know, one of the other person was actually killed. I think it was Münzenberg. I
Munzenberg
think
was killed.
Münzenberg. He was killed pretty decisively, and yeah, and of course you had some of these famous post-war German guys, Rudi
Karl
Dutschke.
Radek was arrested and gotten rid of,
Yeah,
and
I
he
mean
was at that 1922 meeting.
we
Yeah.
had some guys here. They became so famous and influential, and they started out as communists, and then they started to doubt Moscow, and then suddenly they got shot, and then they died in their bathtub magically. It's just interesting how that happens. And then
Yeah, I mean, it happened to Trotsky's son. It happened to Trotsky.
yeah,
It happened to,
um,
Kamenev and Zinoviev and
yeah,
Bukharin.
and
Lots of big name communists.
yeah, and there's this Theodor Adorno, from the Frankfurt School. He wrote about this famous incident in Germany. Now, Americans won't know this, but it's a really interesting case, so I'll just briefly mention it. So, this was a demonstration. This was a protest on June the 2nd of 1967 in West Berlin. So basically, a bunch of leftists were protesting against the Shah of Iran because he was about to visit, and West Germany was working with Iran. So at this protest, this all went sideways, and a young student was shot. His name was Benno Ohnesorg. And so he became like the martyr. He became the symbolic cause to rally around, because according to the official story, this right-wing authoritarian police officer had just shot the young leftist student just out of sheer evil will. So this is how the case was presented. Now, of course, many years later, it turned out that this police officer actually worked for the Stasi, the East German Soviet intelligence agency. Now, of course, he did. I mean, it's clear that he shot him. It's clear he was Stasi. He just claimed that the Stasi didn't instruct him to shoot the kid. Whichever way, but this goes to show how this thinking is just ingrained in people. So it becomes sort of this. It's not exactly racism. It became racism over time because white people are all evil. It became racism, but it was also the use of the techniques of discrimination. So if you were a conservative, if you cared about certain things, if you hated communism, you were just typecast, you were labeled, there were all these cliches projected onto you. And many young people started to believe that because they thought, well, my father is authoritarian, so that this must be true then. All these prejudices, they must be true. And this is how they played. This is how they played that game. And uh,
You mentioned anti-communism. This book here, Marxism, Leninism on War and Army, which was translated by the U.S. Air Force. There's a section in this book where it talks about anti-communism is the leading edge of imperialist ideology, and it talks about how combating anti-communism is the key to the victory of Marxism, Leninism, in its future war, even because you have to. Without anti-communism, the imperialists can't. They don't have the answers in the crisis of modernity. They don't have the answers to fight against communism, and so a lot of this is about pulling the rug out from under anti-communism. So, for example, if you look at all the critical race theory, critical theory, which is just criticizing the existing society, criticizing, because of the legacy of slavery, because of the race war against Indians for 200-300 years in North America. You have, of course, the war with Mexico. You have the Spanish American War, where we went into the Philippines. We've got all these things which are essentially tragic things that happen in the history of every country, right? Whether they're socialist or
yeah,
so-called capitalist, it always happens that countries, people get into wars, they try to do things, they get into conflicts, and people get hurt. And of course, there's injustice. Of course, there's your George Armstrong Custer's, attacking women and children, and there's slavery, because human beings aren't perfect. There is no utopia. But by making it all about what's wrong all the time with everything that exists, if an anti-communist comes up and says, "Look, they killed 11 million people in the Ukraine terror famine. Stalin and Lenin killed 5-6 million people. Stalin killed 30, 40, 50, 60 million people." Um, all of a sudden they can claim, oh, well, the slave trade killed 100 million black Africans, or killed, 10 million Indians, even though these numbers are grossly exaggerated. They frame their multicultural history as it's just criticism of the West as being more monstrous than anything socialism has done, even though we know by a true accounting that the Soviet regime was a murderous tyranny that killed, muzzled, and impoverished, 300 million people in the former Soviet Union. And in China, killed, Mao
yeah,
killed, 60 million, 80 million. We don't know the numbers in China, and are still murdering people. And that the Lao guy, according to Mr. Wu, who wrote Bitter Winds and the History of the Lao guy, um, that basically um, there were 20 million people in the Laogai. That's the Chinese concentration camp system. And of course, we've got the killing fields of Cambodia,
yeah.
which people try to blame on Nixon, but it was a Khmer Rouge communist starved a third or a quarter of the population of Cambodia to death. There's so it serves this important purpose of making capitalism seem worse than socialism.
Yeah, and it's just weird how they sold this idea for so long that you can have a double standard, the biggest double standard ever. You just criticize everything in the West, everything that they label authoritarian, while the communist system was just hyper authoritarian. Now, in the USSR would not have survived people's activism for a week. They knew that. That's why they made every activism illegal. But in the West, where do you, as a person growing up, where do you experience authoritarianism? First, it's like the father in the family, or it could be the mother. the parents, they have to be in charge. Then it's the teachers. Then it's, or you do military service, compulsory military service. So your officers, they become the
The
authoritarians.
policeman that gives you
Exactly.
tickets on the road.
The policemen, and then of course the politicians and everybody who runs a business. So if you work for any type of business, the leadership of the business, the leadership, they have to make things run. They have to make things function and operate. So, and of course, there are terrible bosses. There are, decent, good bosses. There are even brilliant bosses. But you're supposed to view them all. The traffic cop, your boss. You have to view them all as one evil conspiratorial group, the authoritarians, and then the communists. They give you all these little tools to subvert every form of authority. Even though, tell me one thing that runs properly without a proper hierarchy. And people they confuse oppression and hierarchies. Now, a hierarchy is something that you can find anywhere, and you depend on hierarchies. If you're in a car accident and you get to the emergency room, you expect a functioning hierarchy of people. So the person in charge, who's commanding all the other people around, the person in charge has the authority because he deserves it and because he's supposed to be in that position. And you don't want, stupid debates. I mean, imagine if you come in with multiple injuries and these people start having a silly philosophical debate about what to do and who should make the decisions. No, there needs to be a functioning hierarchy, and people are in charge who know the most. And they ultimately make the decisions. They make the calls.
And with authority comes, like if the authority is an owner of a business or an elected official, with authority comes responsibility.
Yeah.
Right? The buck stops here. So you are suddenly responsible, and that's not an easy burden for people to take.
Yeah. There's this movie from, I think it was 1999, that became sort of a sleeper hit. It's called Fight Club. Maybe people have seen the movie Fight Club. It's about It's about this guy who is super unhappy. He has a job. He works for a car company, and he feels dehumanized. And he comes from a broken family, so his father was no good. And he becomes so depressed, and so he cannot sleep anymore. And he develops all these techniques to make himself feel better. So it's compulsory shopping. Then he goes to a doctor and he wants pills. Then he goes to these self-help groups and he pretends to have cancer or something to get sympathy. He tries all these things, and then this character comes into his life by the name of Tyler Durden. And Tyler Durden turns him on to another more dangerous crutch to make himself feel better, which is violent activism that morphs into terrorism. And there's this one scene where the protagonist is sort of halfway out of it, and he just listens to the philosophical ramblings of his guru, Tyler Durden. And Durden says something that sounds more like leftist anarchism or, sort of half-baked leftist ideas. He talks about how we're going to destroy the banks, we're going to destroy the government, and then we can roam the earth wearing leather clothing, and it's all just nature and purity, and this is our goal. But of course, over time, the protagonist realizes that this was just another crutch. This was just another, pill or another way of avoiding
in fact,
personal
Tyler
responsibility.
Doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Tyler Durden doesn't exist.
And he destroys Tyler Durden by saying, I'm going to start taking responsibility. For the first time in my life, I'm going to not blame everybody else for my problems. I'm going to adapt. I'm going to take charge. I'm not just following some guy and his ideology. I've tried every crutch there is, and they all stink. And this is how the movie ends. And there are books out there like this one, Friction, How Radicalization Happens to Them and Us. And this is sort of the stuff that the communists knew early on because of all the research they stole or took or whatever. So they identify all these factors that define a person that you can further radicalize through propaganda. So, for example, if these people as children had developmental problems, they were victims of abuse. If the parents are no good, poverty, divorced parents, or absent parents, uh, just being bullied in school, bad grades in school, or social disorganization of the community. So these are all factors that are well understood, and you can increase these factors if you have your communist assets everywhere. You can make life worse. This is what Münzenberg said. We're going to make everything stink. So everything becomes more terrible. So it's easier to radicalize more people, and they also figured
Yeah,
out.
Eric Verglen wrote about this, saying that it was the personality that was broken in this way that the character in the Fight Club movie is, that's seeking a kind of identity, that can't find themselves, that is neurotic. And he uses the term alienated for this personality, saying that, and this is where he says the Gnostic movements, he calls them Gnostic, because they are hostile to the existing way of the world. And he says, so by such movements, we mean progressivism, positivism, Marxism, psychoanalysis, communism, fascism, and National Socialism. He identifies all of them as stemming from this, and you could say all of them are kind of a crutch in the way that Tyler Durden is a crutch for the character in the Fight Club movie. Um, so it is. He says that when it comes to murder, and talking about the Tyler Durden character, elevating the violence, the Fight Club, up to all the way to terrorism, he said that the reason for the murder and the desire to murder is that it gives a false sense of identity and meaning to the person. It gives them a false personhood when they don't feel
Yeah,
they have a personhood.
exactly. And also there's some other factors that play into this. So even if you don't have a specific trauma with a person, or if this person grew up in a sort of normal fashion, you can still trigger that person through boredom and overcrowding. So tight spaces, small apartments, overcrowded classrooms, lots of people, lots of chatter. You just bore these people almost to death, and
And by the way, the public school system does that.
yeah,
It
exactly.
definitely tries to
So they,
bore.
they tested this with lab animals, and they were submitting these lab animals to overcrowding and boredom and just confined spaces, and they were watching these animals go literally insane. And this is something that sort of works for humans as well. And if people remember these gigantic apartment complexes in communist states, now for example in Eastern Germany, it's overcrowding. It's these confined spaces. So it's not just a lack of money in productivity in communism. This was also very, very much intentional. And so this is what then leads to the option of putting these dogmatic beliefs into people. Now, this is something that cult movements have perfected as well. If you can find the right techniques to plant these ideas into people, so that these people will defend these ideas against all reality, everything and anything. So this is how you create
No, there's a
a
sense
true
in
believer.
which like National Socialism and communism are almost like paranoid schizophrenia,
Yeah,
because there's this paranoia. They think somebody's out to get them, like the National Socialists. It's the Jews are out to get them, or everything's a capitalist conspiracy or plot. The plot of the banksters, the plot of the big money capitalists. And you saw that in Stalin's purges. He said there was wrecking going on when their economic quotas weren't met, and they had to arrest people and put them on trial. And there is a funny thing where there's a theory that narcissism You've got all the way from phallic narcissism at the low end all the way up to full-blown malignant narcissism is on a scale with schizophrenia. That is, you end up in this solipsistic paranoia
Detached
where
from
you're
reality.
actually detached from reality. Yeah, and so if you look at communist, there's a kind of semblance of an attempt to analyze reality in Karl Marx, but then it really is not reality. It's very vicious and it's very paranoid, and it also involves envy. And there's a book, and I recommend it to everyone. It's The Malignant Self-Love by Sam Vaknin, the Israeli, because he is a self-confessed malignant narcissist slash psychopath, writing about the condition from having it, having the condition, and saying that envy, you're eaten up in the inside with envy for other people, that you desire power, that you desire to be exalted, to be up like a god, up, to have other people worship and admire you. And this is all compensation for this depressed little shriveled, person that has must surround themselves with delusions of grandeur. And this is almost integral to communist and national socialist thinking,
Yeah.
and the thinking of many cults.
I mean, the communists, they knew very early on from German psychologists and scientists like Wilhelm Wundt, they knew about developmental psychology. So they were studying this phenomenon when children, they start to detach from their parents because they have to become adults one day themselves. And so this is what all the parents experience when the kids, if you're a decent parent, the kids will adore you. But when they become sort of early teenagers, then they find you stupid, or they want to try out different things, or they're just more focused on friends, maybe. This is sort of a normal process that can be subverted by exploiting these inherent tensions in the family. So when these young people, or even in their 20s, when they're identity seeking, this is where you can catch them. And by giving them a group identity, you're giving them a new family. You're giving them sort of a tribe which they were longing for, because we are tribe people. This is how we developed over more than 100,000 years. We want to belong to a tribe. So this is what was understood by these shrinks. And if you get these people hooked, you can teach them some methods. For example, critical theory. You can teach them all these kind of activist little measures and methods to feel something. So by doing an act of rebellion against your parents, you smoke marijuana, or you drink under the age of 21, whatever it is in America, or you don't perform in school, you just boycott the school system, or you announce to your parents that you want to become an artist and not have a real job. These acts of rebellion individually, they give you a little rush of hormones and the feeling of control. Because usually, as a young person, or even in your 20s, you may not feel a great deal of control. Now, this is inherent in all large societies, because not everybody can control everything, right? And so if you feel powerless and you're taught these methods and you start applying this stuff, and the internet made it easier and cheaper, you just do a little thing, and it's almost like a little drug high. You just stuck it to someone, you just you have this rush of control, and you get this feeling of, I'm part of a larger tribe, so together we are powerful. And this is a familiar effect that you get from alcohol, because when you drink, you may feel more confident, you may feel more attached to these other people around you, and it's addictive, because the more you use it, the more you get yourself into trouble. Now, when you do this left-wing critical theory activism, you make life a lot harder for yourself. You start making bad decisions. You just, so many young women, as this happened in Germany post-war a lot. So these young women, they would choose the rebel. They would hook up with the rebel, get pregnant, and then the rebel leaves them. The rebel just abandons them, and they're stuck with a child, and they're a single mother. And they didn't pick a proper career, so they're dependent on the state now, and they're dependent on their leftist friends. So this will get you in trouble. It's the same with alcohol, right? It makes you feel good for a moment, but it has these drawbacks, and there's also a withdrawal when you stop using it. So many people are depressed, according to statistics. Roughly 1/3, and I'm not kidding. This is in the numbers. Roughly 1/3 of the current German population is mentally ill in a clinical sense. Now, this can mean everything. This can mean depression.
Now, where did
And
you get that statistic? That's interesting.
I recently did a show where I quoted the current expert estimates and the numbers they pull from medical files. And this basically means they count people. This could be a depression. This could be panic attacks. And every
Could this
year,
be just neurosis? Neurosis is counted as a mental illness?
once it reaches a certain threshold. So Germany is a mess, of course, right? And so every year, some of these people, they manage to fix their problem, but there's new people developing a problem. And so this is especially...
Well, I'll give you an idea here. I know I've watched the obesity statistics go from 39, I think they're up to 42% of the U.S. population is obese now, and it's climbing. And of course, it's climbing toward 50%. Now, there may be some people who have a physiological problem, but I think that can't be explained because, 100 years ago or 80 years ago or even 60 years ago, 42% of the population wasn't obese. It was a tiny percentage. So this is not something physiological that people have inherited. So there has to be a psychological component, right, to obesity. That is that there's a inability of the person to control their
to experience
eating.
joy without, food, junk food.
Without this addiction. And of course, people have described addiction as also is a kind of mental problem because you have decided that you need a drug to get through life. So let's say if we say that everybody who is morbidly obese, right, that is obese, this 42% is mentally not well, and then we add all the drug addicts and alcoholics to that number, you're going to go over 50%, right?
Yeah, and
Which is
easy.
really strange. But you're saying just a third, right? So you're really estimating down.
Well, they don't mention estimates of things that are not diagnosed because these people avoid psychological care, such as antisocial disorder or psychopaths or malignant narcissism, because only a fraction of those people actually goes to a shrink and gets diagnosed or tries to get treatment for it. So,
have you seen, what are the statistics you've seen on malignant narcissism? I think I've seen anywhere from 2 to
5%,
to several percent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's like so. I mean, of course, a person who suffers from depression can still be functional in other ways, can be productive. Or somebody who suffers from panic attacks can be a person who is functional, who is getting things done. But then, of course, you get, the narcissists and the psychopaths, and that's of course not good. And so many people over the last decades here in Germany, they tried to live the leftist lifestyle, but they just became horribly depressed, and they're not well. And the stuff they're using, the drug they're using, it's not working. But once you program that stuff into them, they're like junkies. If you say your ideology is no good, that you're attacking their identity, you're attacking their sense of hope, you're attacking their sense of community, you're attacking anything they attach value to. And you're attacking their view on how evil works and how good works. So by taking that away from them or by them abandoning them, they're left with nothing. And so
another measure is people on psych meds. And a new study came out in the US that 1 in 6 Americans are on psych meds, right? So you can't say that someone is well if they're taking psych meds. You can't say they're
Correct.
mentally well, right? There is an underlying illness there. And then we get into the question now. I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Zaz, but there was a lot of work done. He goes back to the 1880s and 90s when it started. The insanity defense started to be used in the United
Yeah.
States in courts, and he talks about oh the fellow, the psychologist that was in the concentration camp, um, that wrote the great book on meaning, um, whose name has escapes me, but he observed, he was a psychologist and he was in a camp, and of course Hitler emptied out all the mental hospitals, and for a while was exterminating the mentally ill and the retarded. And but he was in a concentration camp next to one where they put all these mentally ill people, schizophrenics, manic depressives, and so on. And of course, in that environment, if you didn't work, if you couldn't function, they just would take you out and shoot you, right?
Yeah.
Because you had to work. And so he watched, fascinated. What happened was that all these mentally ill people who went into the camp, they suddenly were cured. They didn't have the mental illness anymore. They were working and they were just following the rules. And this psychologist had witnessed. And of course, Zaz begins his book, The Myth of Mental Illness, with this, and then goes on into discussing the malingering, using the insanity defense. And he sort of says, look, mental illness is it's an it's a metaphor, right? Because the mind can't be ill, the body can't. You can have a brain disease, that's different. That's a disease in the body. If somebody hits you on the head with a hammer, you're going to be unconscious. So that's a physical problem, not a mental problem. You have a concussion. You have a brain tumor that makes you black out or it causes you to have delusions. But what Zaz is saying is that with these people who are physically normal, but yet are diagnosed with these things, and he said he kind of argues that the chemistry, the brain chemistry, isn't the cause of the mental illness. It just happens after. It's a result of the mental illness, the changes in the brain. But he makes the argument that it's a form of malingering that may even be there may be unconscious mechanisms or conscious mechanisms that in a sense the person is attempting to escape responsibility, whether it's claiming the insanity defense or whether it's being insane to escape responsibility as an adult. That you just can't take the pressure anymore, and so you just
Yeah.
you blank out, become crazy. Um, and so this is an actual argument about mental illness, and that it's malingering, and that in essence, and this is one of the things that concerns me about it, is that as life gets easier and easier, right? I mean, it actually is easier than 100 years ago, than 200
Hmm.
years ago. Life was really hard for people. It was really a grind 150 years ago. People really had to be tough to get through life, and they really had to work hard. And now that they don't, it's like they become weaker and weaker, and then they can take what they can take is less and less. It's almost like if you raise somebody in zero gravity. I have the joke of the zero gravity chicken. What does a zero gravity chicken look like? It can't stand up. It's this raw, round ball of fat that if you put it in normal gravity, it would die of a heart attack instantly. It couldn't take the pressure of its own weight after a while. So as you make life easier for people, they become weaker inwardly, weaker mentally, so that if any pressure is applied to them where they have to do certain things, if they can get out of it, they're suddenly crazy. It's funny in the concentration camp example, when it's a choice between life and death, they snap too. But if they can get out of responsibility without any consequences, they'll do this malingering thing.
Yeah.
So
And of course,
I
if you
wonder if the
have
communists understood that too.
yeah, if you have all this knowledge on developmental psychology, you know what works and what causes damage. So you figure out, okay, a healthy human being experiences this, that, and the other. So by denying that stuff, you get an individual who is not well, or who cannot take the pressure of life. Okay, so this psychology, I think, was one of the secrets to success for the communists. Now, I talked about this example, which became a stereotype. You know, the young girls, they want to be with the rebel guy, the left-wing rebel guy, who tries to emulate, you know, the famous left-wing terrorists, has the same kind of jacket and the same kind of hairstyle. So the cool guy, the rebel, leaves the woman with the child, so now the child has no father. And then you get this sort of commune lifestyle, which was also experimented on quite a lot in Germany. And they were introducing all kinds of stuff. They were saying we shouldn't have any doors. You know, we shouldn't look down at sexual relationships between adults and children. And they were experimenting with all this stuff. They had done studies in Germany where they would these weirdo scientists they would intentionally wield their influence so pedophiles could get custody of children or become foster parents of children. And then these scientists would observe what actually happens, how this all plays out. So this is basically human experimentation. And also, this transgender phenomenon also goes back to Germany, to this place, and very early research. So, for example, the leading scientific body concerning transgender health, the organization is called WPATH, and this was founded in 1979 by the endocrinologist and sexologist Harry Benjamin. Or Harry Benjamin. He promoted in the year 1912 in Tübingen, and he was studying at an early German institute of studying sexuality. Now, this was a private institution by a man called Magnus Hirschfeld, who was supposed to be the leading scientist of his era. And this is also the guy who sent compromising material on Adolf Hitler to the Soviet Union. Now, this is some old police files, you know, about Hitler's past. So Magnus Hirschfeld himself was a homosexual, and he talked about this. He said, yeah, he got the police files about Hitler, very early Hitler, with photos and everything. And he put this all in a package and sent it to Moscow. What they did with it, we don't know. So there was also that element to it. And the scientific partner of Mr. Hirschfeld was Arthur Kronfeld, who later worked in Moscow. And in 1905, Mr. Hirschfeld also visited Cambridge. And in
these are all part of these Comintern networks. And
yeah,
of
yeah,
course,
they're all communists. Yeah,
what Waller's, I should, you know, we're talking about Waller, J. Michael Waller's book, and what he's pointing out is that this normalization of abnormality, of making things that are neurotic or mentally ill, or showing a personality disorder, normalizing personality disorders. At the same time, you're making normal people into the crazy ones, which is sort of built into this whole thing. You have, and this is what he's pointing out in the book, is that in the intelligence community, you go from the schools where these mentalities are cultivated and justified, and then you're bringing it into this FBI and the CIA, and so that you have this thing in the FBI. I didn't know this, but they actually actively demand that FBI personnel not just at work, you know, show appreciation for homosexuals and transgendered, but they get out and they join gay parades in their private life. That they're supposed to exemplify gay values, you know, embracing gay people in their regular life outside of work, outside of the FBI, which was really amazing to me that this would be pushed. And of course, it wasn't there was an attempt to the attempts to do this, they had to kind of backtrack a little bit. But this is where they want to take it.
Yeah, and of course, if you have somebody nowadays, somebody joining the FBI who is homosexual, right? Let's say what is the typical age of somebody becoming an FBI agent? I'd say like 25, something like that, maybe.
Yeah, probably right
So
after
okay,
college.
so something like 25. So that means that person was a teenager a decade ago. And so a decade ago, you didn't have this big publicized activism about LGBTQ and whatnot, and so this person likely experienced rejection from peers, or he had to hide his sexuality, and so he's not he doesn't grow up like somebody else would grow up, and this can become a problem when this person then joins the FBI and works in intelligence, because he's supposed to have this loyalty to the entire population, and he's supposed to have this loyalty to the Constitution and the order of things. And but even as early as the year 1900 or the 1910s, communists, they approached gay people because gay people were sort of in their own world, and so it's just something that people should be aware while recruiting someone. It's not just all nice and dandy how diverse we are and stuff like that, but you have to look at the person and you have to realize, is this person suitable overall to be an FBI agent and work in, let's say, counterintelligence?
Yeah, it
What?
was by the 1990s. They're encouraging gay people to be recruited into the FBI, CIA, NSA. In fact, in 1999, they had a big event in the intelligence community where they had like this giant event where all the gay people in the intelligence community were taken to this event that celebrated them.
Yeah,
So that's 25 years ago that happened. And Waller points out in the book that the Eisenhower administration made a rule not to hire gays in the federal government. Of course, I don't even think they didn't use the term gay. I think back in the 1950s, they just were homosexuals. To not hire them in the government. And the reason, and Hoover agreed with Eisenhower on this, that there was this risk, psychologists felt, that people who are homosexual might harbor a grudge against society, as you were
yeah,
kind of pointing out, that they could lash out by committing treason, by giving secrets to a foreign enemy, by in this way. And that's aside from even the possibility of being blackmailed, right? If you're a closet homosexual, you're going to be blackmailed. That is another level in which you can be compromised, that
yeah.
your
Because
own
we talked about
behavior.
yeah,
Yeah.
we talked about the communist concept of authoritarians, right? Because they psychometrically measured how authoritarian a person is, and so a kid growing up gay, this kid will come into contact with people in positions of authority. So, for example, the father, what was the father's opinion about the son coming out as gay, or the school teacher, or the sports teacher and the classmates. So there's a lot of rejection maybe, and there's some people in positions of authority that react a certain way, and this is yeah, as you said, people may be harboring or a distrust
Well,
of
and
general society.
a half a century ago, before they changed the personality disorder, they had homosexuality more than 50 years ago was a personality disorder in the psychology. I forget what they call the book that gives all the authoritative book in psychology that gives the personality disorders. And then they made it wasn't a personality disorder. But back then, and I talked to an elderly psychologist about this some years ago. She said that the thinking was in psychology that it was that with male homosexuals, it was the single mother home where there was no father, where the child identifies with the mother. That is, a sense of identity is attached to the mother. There's no attachment to a father figure. So they're not able to develop the masculine side of their personality. So they identify with the female, and that creates this sexual identity confusion. That was the theory back then, back in back in the 1960s, which is kind of intriguing. So that when you're talking about Germany in the single family home situation, which, by the way, feminism is trying to encourage, the feminism that the Marxists have been pushing forward, and then the welfare state that the communists want, which also bleeds the government so there's no money for weapons and defense. That also encourages the more single, parent households, which are basically mom raising the kids and no father present. So that if that is a main causal agent in making people mentally, having problems with their identity, causing personality disorders, then they're actually trying to manufacture, by fracturing the family, they're trying to manufacture more abnormal or people with personality disorders to then harvest them as radical activists, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was uh, in recent months there was a kind of a shift, at least in Germany, but also also in the United States. I mean, before that, the trans topic, the trans phenomenon topic, it was presented in a hyper aggressive way. Nobody was supposed to say anything against it. And then you saw J.K. Rowling getting away with it. She the author of the Harry Potter novels. Then you saw massive problems for the Tavistock Clinic in Britain. And then you saw a New York Times article where they was in the New York Times, and they were starting to say, okay, this went overboard. And there was a German state television program which documented people who transitioned but regretted it. So you saw how crazy overboard this went. And I remember in the New York Times story, this was maybe a year ago, maybe 1.5 years ago, in the New York Times story, they were presenting some of these cases and showing you the photos of these kids. So you saw, the obese young girl, for example. Seems to be a classic. Obese young girl, totally unhappy, very depressed, and she never had this experience that other kids had of adults and even the children describing them as beautiful. So it's just this little princess syndrome, because if you have daughters, they love to be princesses and just this hyper feminine thing which they adore. And but if you're an obese girl, an obese child, you don't get this experience. You don't have the little princess experience, and so they become terribly unhappy. They were sent to these clinics, and they told these shrinks they don't feel like a girl because they never had the girl experience. And so then it's this discussion of, well, maybe you're not a girl, maybe you're something in between, or you're this or you're that, or you're a boy really. And the other thing that came up again and again was the girls who were victims of abuse, and they don't want to be girls anymore because they don't want to be targets anymore. Then you get boys, also obese boys, troubled homes, and they never had the boy experience. They never impressed other boys, or they never impressed adults by being tough and resilient and kind of the hero in sports or whatever. And so when you never had this boy experience and you get bullied, then they don't want to be boys. They think they are something else, and it's kind of moving the goalposts, because if you watch children grow up, they need to hit certain targets, just certain milestones in their development. But if some kids, they don't hit these milestones, there's this new explanation shifting the goalposts. Well, they don't, everything's totally fine with them because they're not a boy or girl or whatever. So instead of saying the kid is not reaching these milestones, how can we help this kid reach these milestones? They say these are the wrong milestones. We just have a whole different set of milestones here, and the kid is perfectly hitting those milestones because the kid is identifying as this or the other. So this came up quite a lot. And I've mentioned this number. So a third of the German population is mentally ill in a clinical sense. Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise after World War II. Germans were just mentally shredded, completely shredded. So there was all this stuff, the destruction, the guilt, everything. And so the first thing the Germans did was just to pretend nothing ever happened, right? So on television, you saw what we call Heimatfilme. These are, movies about, Germany and happy things and other eras, and just very, very lighthearted. All the entertainment was made to be very, very lighthearted. It made you feel comfort. And so everybody was just trying to push away the past, just not think about it. And so this created or worsened a lot of mental illness. And this is what the communists then used. They were saying German society is ruined because of authoritarianism and imperialism, and we have the solution. We have the answer. This is how they played it over here. And in America, it was different. I mean, you did have Vietnam. You had Vietnam, and the communists tried to use that. But the Great Depression and farm life when it was really difficult. All these things that happened. Somebody in the family had a bad accident. On the farm, and all this misery was used by the communists to further their goals. In that way. And when you have one person who has severe mental illness, or more than one, this one person affects 5 other people and 10 other people, because the relatives, they have to deal with the situation, they have to help, shrinks have to be involved, this and that and the other. So by just having one person with problems, you cause problems for 10 other persons. So basically, every German is either mentally ill or is very, very close to someone who is mentally ill. Now, the left had promised we're going to fix everything, but everything just became worse and worse and worse. And now people, they lose trust in America. They lose trust in the rule of law. They just they want to try their luck with the Russians or whatever. And this is how they played the game: make everyone totally miserable until nothing really works. Now, Germany, of course, worked in an industrial sense. We went to work, we did precise work, and then we went home and drank beer and watched silly stuff on television. But on a psychological level, we were as dysfunctional as it gets. So nothing really worked at a certain point on a psychological level. So this is kind of what the communists understood very well, very early on. Because
the KGB, the GRU, the strategists in Moscow have this understanding of Germany, that it is a psychological wreck.
Yeah.
And of course, if it's true what they're promoting here, what Michael Waller is saying is, look, they're trying to, with this critical theory and the Frankfurt School stuff, they're trying to make psychological wrecks out of us all. They're trying to get us all to feel sorry for ourselves, which is, by the way, I think that's the core of evil, is this kind of self-regard where you feel sorry for yourself, because then you give yourself permission to act badly, right? Because after all, you're somehow entitled to things, to act badly, to do things. Which I think is one of the things people don't realize about neurosis and about feeling sorry for yourself. So is there any pathway out for Germany?
Well, I mean, Germans are they're somewhat resilient, and they're inventive, and they've been through so much over centuries, really, and they're still kicking. So it's like when these people over here, they're like, you can compare it to people who can't read, in a sense, if that makes sense. What do they call them in English? The
Illiterates
Exactly, illiterate. So
or functional illiterates.
on a psychological level, Germans are very much illiterate. I mean, it's gotten a bit better because of so many people have issues, and then people start to read up on these issues. But once you have a larger understanding of the psychology, and not just the bad stuff, the dysfunctional stuff, but you also have to understand what works and how to make it work. And then if people understand, oh, that's how the Russians play the imperialism game and the intelligence game. Oh, that all functions together. Psychology and intelligence work is sort of married together. Okay, now I get it. Because Germans have never been taught this, really. I mean, even nowadays, after all these crises, the financial crisis of 2008, the Euro crisis of 2013, the migrant crisis of 2015, the coronavirus crisis, and the energy crisis, and now the Ukraine crisis, even then, the only way people react, in a political sense and in an activism sense, the only way people react is by trying out or just supporting fascism or communism. So you have two new parties, and one is basically apparently fascist, and the other one is straight up communist. And both of them are pro-Russian. And also the current ruling party, the Social Democrats, the left, they've been named in the books by defectors, the highest ranking defectors. The Social Democrats have been named as the prime tool of Moscow. So they ruined everything. And now you have these other new parties. One of them is right-wing. The other one is super communist. And these new parties, they want to get voters, and they say, oh, look what these Social Democrats did to us. We're going to fix it. But all three of them are pro-Russia. The Social Democrats are pro-Russia. They've ruined everything. And now these supposed saviors, they're also pro-Russia. I mean, isn't that a fancy little technique, right? You cause more problems, and then you present your solution to this. This is
Yeah. Yeah. Well, of course, if the people who are broken are more malleable and more easily brought into socialism, then that's what you want is broken people. You gave the statistic that 1 in 3 Germans suffer from mental illness. Well, there's a statistic that 1 in 4 German children suffer from mental illness now,
mm-hmm.
which means that it's growing, right?
Yeah.
And of course, you've got, there's a statistic I've seen, 56% of Germans suffer from depression. Now, I don't know what that number is for Americans, but it's pretty high when you have 1 in 6 on psych meds. So it does look like, just from the base statistics, that Germany is a mental health wreck. Now,
Yeah.
they've destigmatized, I understand, mental health. There's been a campaign in Germany to remove the stigma from mental health problems. Am I right about that?
Well, I mean, it's so ubiquitous now that, of course, you cannot just label somebody and just ignore these people or treat them as bad people, because there's such a variety of mental illnesses. So it's something that has become so common, that children have all kinds of troubles and they get all kinds of pills and treatment and all that. I compare it to booby trapping in the Vietnam War. If people remember, in the Vietnam War in the jungle, the communists would try to use booby traps, because if they can injure one American soldier, 5 other American soldiers had to help that injured person and save him while trying to complete the mission, or they have to abort the mission. So you don't get all 5 of them, or 6 or 7 or 10 of them. You get one, you injure one, and then you affect all the other people. And so in Germany, in Germany, it's everybody sort of talks about mental illness, and it's lost the stigma because everybody is somehow affected. You either have a mental illness, or you're very, very close to someone with
Who has one? I mean,
a mental illness.
that's incredible. If 1 in 4 children have mental illness, what
Yeah,
that takes away from the people around them. I mean, a mentally ill person, anyone who's had mental illness in their family knows what a tremendous consumption of time and energy it is
yeah.
to deal with a mentally ill person.
No, so for one example. One example. Now, my father, he grew up for a while with his uncle. The uncle was Theo Benesch. He has a Wikipedia entry because he was pretty. He got pretty high up in the National Socialist Party. He was a member of parliament in Berlin, and he worked his way up in Franken, Bavaria, and then he played in the big league. And this guy was described as incredibly cold, very very strange, pretty evil. I mean, he was a bureaucrat for most of his life, but we got lots of data and lots of photos and postcards. There's one postcard where you see him standing in his uniform, World War One uniform. He was barely an adult in World War One. So he stands there he's smoking a cigarette, and he's just very matter of factly. And then on the backside, he talks about now he's coming home and this and that, and then he became an activist in National Socialism. So he was not normal by any yardstick, and so my father spent considerable time with him, and that apparently damaged my father. So growing up with my father was not easy, and so that made me a potential target for communist subversion. If I hadn't been, if I had been different, if I hadn't been reading a ton, if I hadn't been trying to figure out how humans worked. So this goes from one generation potentially to the next and to the next and to the next. And now, of course, NATO seems to be pretty sure now that there will be a war with Russia. Now imagine
Yes, I've seen that in the news
if
lately.
Germany is this messed up already, and scientists have figured out this was an insurance corporation. I think it was AXA. It was one of the biggest insurance companies, and they broke it down. They identified the most dominant factors in mental illness. And so the war that's probably going to come in a few years will increase almost every single factor that contributes to mental illness. So we're pretty
stress.
Yeah, we're pretty
That is
shredded.
stress.
Yeah, we're pretty shredded already. So what's left of us when this thing is over? Even though we're not in the middle of it, and this and that, because over time, the type of trauma changed. So the first generations post-war, this was sort of the classic, guys died in the war, and women got raped, and babies were born from the rapes, and then these babies grew up and they were bullied because they looked different, and people got injured and traumatized, and people were in Russian prisons for a while and then came back. So you had all these stories. So imagine you grow up, you never saw your father, then some guy comes home, and your mother tells you, well, this man is your father, and he's just fresh out of a Russian prison camp. So this was the first generations of Germany post-war, and then over time, the trauma stuff changed to some related things, other things. And when the migrant crisis happened in 2015, 2016, suddenly we had an influx of people from Africa, from hot war zones or completely broken down societies. So this is when all these crazy crimes happened. Women were just attacked in broad daylight. Some guy with a machete rapes a woman. And we're not used to that stuff anymore. So we got all this other mental illness, and now there's a war coming up. So what is that going to do to us? So what's left of Germany then?
So Germany got the double barrel treatment, and it seems to be worse with children. And I think it seems to be getting worse in the United States too. This was a question I raised with Michael Waller last week, a few days ago, when I did my interview with him. Was that okay? So we have these dysfunctional people in the FBI and the CIA, and they're actually hiring people on the basis of their dysfunction rather than on their qualifications, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like equal opportunity hiring kind of thing, and they want these dysfunctional people. And he even goes through an ad you probably read it in the book about a young lady who it's all about me, me,
Mm,
me, but she's even bragging about her own mental illness, her own
yeah.
problems, her own mental deficits. So it's very, very strange. And I said to him, look, if you were able to reform the CIA and the FBI, and you were able to get these people out of these jobs and get better people in. The problem is our universities, our schools are all steeped in this stuff, and so you're cranking out more and more dysfunctional people out of the schools, telling them that they're entitled, telling them that there's something wrong with the normal society, that the abnormal is the new normal. Um, how do you fix that? And of course, you have to change the schools. But in Germany, it's got to be the school system's got to be a mess too.
In Germany. Oh yeah, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
it's yeah. I mean, there's three kinds of schools here, depending on how good your grades are. So, if you go to the highest kind of school, it's relatively calm on these schools. There's still some drug dealing. There's still some dysfunctional people around. But if you're in the middle type school, it's just very chaotic. Lots of drugs and chaos and just mayhem. And the lowest kind of school, even more mayhem. So it's not fun. It's not fun to grow up, and so people, they get depressed. People, they get anxious. And I had this discussion with somebody. He was sort of an activist, more like conservative activist. A bit truther, a bit truther stuff mixed in, and he was complaining about his organization, his group, because like these one or two people that joined the group, they caused so much chaos. I mean, this goes back to a few people can wreck an organization. So he was
Yeah.
complaining about these people and how completely nuts they are. I mean, not just having panic attacks or something, but some malicious, really malicious, weird mental issues like psychotic and schizo and really mixed with narcissism and just this really bad stuff. And he was complaining, and I said, why don't you filter these people out? Why don't you have why don't you just have certain standards and screen these people better? And he said, well, if we screen better, then too few people will actually join the group. So we can't find people that are willing to do something. It's easier to find people when you have low standards. So it's kind of
Well,
this
there's a
thing where
problem. There's no Gideon's army concept there, is there?
you're either in Germany, you're either a boring person or you're crazy. And so the boring people, they want to stay healthy, they want to just do their stuff, and they hope for the best, and they don't want to be involved in activism or any kind of stuff. And this is a huge problem. But I mean, Germans, you can teach Germans anything if you present it as sort of a mechanical issue. So if you teach them, okay, this goes into there, this lever and this thing moves the other thing, then they will get it eventually, because it's sort of like what the activists or the malicious activists are trying to teach people. It's sort of this simplified idea of how things work, the mechanisms. So they teach them, oh, it's really simple. You do this and then that happens. I mean, that's not reality, but it gives people comfort because they start to believe they can control things that way, and they can get some sort of sense of control over their lives and the future. So yeah, lots of depressed people. I mean, especially the Green movement. The Green Party in Germany used to be completely Moscow. I mean, the Greens, they were visiting Moscow, just heaping praise on Moscow in the 80s. When Chernobyl happened, they really didn't care at first. They were really silent about that. And so nowadays, these green activists that glue themselves to the roads, I don't know if you've seen this, they call them the climate gluers. They glue their hands with super glue to the streets, and they block the streets. And these people are very, very much depressed because most of them are vegans, and they cannot really function without pills. And so this is kind of a regular occurrence that these people are just in a in a really bad mental state, because climate anxiety has been added, especially by this insurance company. Climate anxiety is now one of the leading contributing causes to mental illness in Germany. So the fear of
Okay.
war.
Like Greta Thunberg's.
Yeah, so I mean, Greta Thunberg was also very, very mentally ill, and her sister, and that's in the book written by, I think, the mother. So these
What
kids,
mental illness does she suffer from? I have read that too.
um,
What is it exactly?
well, according to the book, which is from the family, these children had some severe brain issues. The
I
sister,
heard it was autism in the case of Greta.
that's mixed in there, yeah, but it was other things too, because the
Mm.
sister, for example, she would go absolutely bonkers with from a variety of noises and sounds. So there were
Hmm.
just many sounds that she just could not bear, and she would go completely bonkers. And Greta, she had these she had these complete meltdowns. I mean, very hyper aggressive meltdowns. So, for example, if the parents put their foot down and said, "This is how it goes," Greta would throw an epic cosmic tantrum. It was so bad on a regular basis that the day would end in a psychiatric emergency room. So basically, the
Hmm.
kids had to be sedated to stop the tantrum. This was so out of control, and Greta, she started to hate people, apparently. So she hated everybody, and everything. And so the climate activism was the moment when everything changed. Suddenly, she became more manageable, more quiet. She had a cause, she had a purpose, and the
So the
parents
aggression could be focused outward.
the parents were just happy that these kids, or especially Greta, started to function in a basic way, because and she was not eating. She refused to eat and she refused to speak. So she was very malnourished, and this was
Hmm.
becoming a life-threatening problem. And this was
So
sort
this
of like,
is a mentally disturbed person then.
yeah, and it's not just refusing to eat outright. She was completely horrified by most foods. So the shrinks
Hmm.
had to find specific foods prepared in a very specific way that she could slowly start to eat. And it always had to be the same thing. So she barely made it out alive from her childhood and early teens. But the climate, rebellion, that changed everything, and the parents were just happy that the kid was changing. But yeah,
Hmm.
it's not exactly clear how many different mental illnesses she has, how far her hatred, just is directed towards all kinds of people. If she's now
Yeah.
advertising for Hamas or whatever, I mean, all kinds of stuff she doesn't really understand, and these partners she worked with, these Germans, famous Germans, she worked with, they're pretty clear in their intentions. I mean, they do want to end any sort of republic and any capitalism, because they have this old Leninist view that you have to destroy the whole thing. You cannot just change this and that. You have to destroy the whole thing and replace it with something else. And
Socialism, of course, of
yeah,
course. Yeah. Well, I've got to run, and so we're at the end of our time. And I want to thank you for doing this. Again, Alex, this is Alex Benesch in Germany. I'm Jeff Nyquist in the U.S. We've been discussing the culture war. We've been discussing the corruption and the insanity of the culture war, how it leads to insanity. And I want to thank you all for joining us. This has been Friends and Enemies.